Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at how you should be preparing for the new contest mode dungeon coming up next month. If you guys didn't know, Bungie put a short little paragraph about it in the latest TWAB. If you call it a twid, you're dead to me. But yeah, it looks like we're going to have a contest day 1 dungeon, and this video is going to act as a guide for what kind of gear you should have ready to go going into it. So first of all, let's start off with exotic armor for each class. And we'll start it off with Warlock, the most versatile class, of course. First and foremost, I would go with a Star Eater's class item. Apotheosis is pretty good for the boss damage, but it's not really as big of a deal as I think people make it out to be. But anything with Star Eater is going to be good, just so that you can get that super beefy Nova Bomb damage. Next up, Rain of Fire, one of the best ways to get high DPS if you're stuck on Solar Warlock for running well, and obviously is one of the easiest ways to just get a constant stream of Radiant for the entire team without any sort of thinking. I'd also suggest having some Sunbracers ready. It's not the most powerful build anymore, but once again, if you're on Solar Warlock, Sunbracers are a great way to clear out adds with just your abilities. And the last two, the support setups, are going to be Cenotaph so that you can make ammo with Trace Rifles, and the Speaker's Helm so that you can do constant heal turret spam if your team needs that. Moving on to Hunters, probably the best class in the game right now. Number 1, I think we all know it's coming. You're going to want to have Celestial ready to go. Then for the class item, I'd actually recommend having at least 2 of them. One of them being a Seared Arachne's Facade version so that you can be super tanky if you ever need that. And one with Synthoceps in case we end up having a boss where you're going to want to do melee damage to them. For either of the 4th column perks, I'd recommend having Inmost Light on both of them because it's basically just the best 3rd column perk there is overall. And then for the last 2 regular exotics, I would have Lucky Pants ready to go in case it's not disabled for this contest, and Orpheus Rigs as well so that you can spam tethers for roam content. As for Titans, which I, for the most part, probably wouldn't recommend playing, but if you are playing Titan, I'd bring Hazardous Propulsion. It's a pretty nice way to add some extra damage on top of your damage rotation that you're doing. The damage buff it gives isn't really that big of a deal, but the rockets it shoots out actually do decent damage. If you're able to hit all of them with maximum debuffs and stuff, they do about 200k damage. I'd also suggest having a starter class item, so that way you can get the damage buff on Twilight Arsenal. That way it's almost as good as Nova Bomb. Not quite, but getting there. I'd also suggest having regular Synthoceps, not the class item version. The class item version is also really good for your consecrations, which I'd highly recommend using. However, you also want to have a Synthoceps for your regular versions as well. That way you can apply it to your super if you need that. If we happen to have a boss which is compatible with the Glacial Quake super, then you'll want to have Synthoceps to buff its damage. And the bosses that this might include would be any kind of walker tank, maybe a boss with funky hitboxes like Riven or anything like that. There's just a couple of enemies in the game that Glacial Quake just absolutely annihilates for some reason, and basically I'm just telling you to have Synthoceps in case one of those bosses are here. And lastly, I would take Peregrine Greaves. That way you can have the Destruction of Champion shoulder charge if that ever comes up. Probably the least important option though. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about exotic weapons, and then towards the end we'll talk about legendary weapons, which are going to be pretty broad. So for the kinetic slot, I would recommend having Outbreak Prime. Outbreak is pretty much a good backup DPS option if you are completely out of all ammo, and it's also a decent choice for generating heavy ammo on adds with your kinetic slot weapon if that happens to be what you need. I'd recommend having Izanagi's Burden as well. It's not really amazing in the current meta, but there are certain situations where it's definitely the best burst damage option. For example, if we have something like Explicator in this dungeon where you have 3 plates with a short time to damage and a short break between them, you're going to want something that can repeatedly do high burst without any sort of downtime, which is going to put Izzy even above Still Hunt for something like that. Very niche, but I think it's worth having it just in case it happens to matter. I also suggest somebody on your team have a Navigator with Catalyst, so that way you can produce grapple points for the team in case you end up doing grapple DPS. And a Lumina can also be helpful if you don't have any other source of global damage buff like Well or Radiant or anything going on. You could use Lumina to get a 35% buff with just your exotic kinetic slot. And lastly, I'd recommend Forerunner. Basically, this is just a Tormentor popper. If there's going to be Tormentors and they're going to be annoying, Forerunner's pretty good. Next up in the energy slot, I would recommend having Ergo Sum, specifically actually 3 of them. And I know that's a lot, but it's a really good sword. The first one I'd recommend is the Arc Conductor roll. This one has been all over the channel if you follow me. Basically, it's one of the best ad clear options in the game, and it keeps you extremely protected even while being very aggressive. I highly recommend it, and you want to get it with the wave frame ideally, but pretty much anything that isn't vortex or aggressive frame is still going to be pretty good. Then I would recommend having a Gjallarhorn sword, basically one that can produce Wolfpack rounds. That way if we end up needing to do sword DPS, you can have that for your team, so that way you guys are getting the extra damage from that. And lastly, I'd recommend having a Polaris caster roll. This is going to be the hardest one to get, but it's also super good just on its own. It can even be a ranged rotation weapon if you want to make it, but it's also one of the best swords in the game, and it's only in your special slot. Then I would recommend having Cloud Strike. It's a great sniper option for everybody, and I would also have Still Hunt, again for everybody but especially on a Hunter, and this can replace Cloud Strike if you're going to be playing Hunter. I'd also suggest having Choir of One set up and ready to go. It's a very versatile weapon and there's a good chance that it will come in use somewhere, and it might even be a good DPS option as a very safe and simple choice. I'd also suggest having some older weapons that aren't really thought about as much, like Merciless and Fourth Horseman. Merciless can be very powerful in dungeons because it's very easy to get kills in DPS phase a lot of the time. And Fourth Horseman is going to be a very niche pick, but just in case there happens to be some kind of mechanic where you just need to instantaneously disintegrate a major, Fourth Horseman is the weapon for that. And lastly, I would also have a Divinity, at least one person on your team, just in case that ends up being the best way to do something. It probably won't be, but there's always that chance it is, and it's good to have it. And finally, for the exotic heavies, we've got a couple of staples in Gjallarhorn and Tractor, just in case those are the best options for your team. Gali, even outside of DPS, is very good at just doing roam content and ad clear from a very safe distance while still having very potent ad clearing damage. And obviously it's also a pretty good support weapon for DPS, even if you're using it outside of DPS some and not purely for DPS. I think overall it's just a very versatile and powerful weapon. Tractor Cannon also pretty much the best way to get a debuff in the game, however it does cost a heavy slot, so it kind of just depends on what your team layout is, but I would have one ready to go just in case. And then for the real weapons, I'd recommend having Acreus ready to go. This can probably replace swords for the most part, however it's a little bit harder to execute, it does do more damage than swords. I'd also suggest having Microcosm ready in case there's any subjugators that need to be taken out. It's going to be the best weapon for that. It's also a decent roll weapon against stuff like Tormentors if you want to use your heavy weapon against them. Just bear in mind, it is not that great of a DPS weapon like some people have said it is, and I'd suggest using other stuff, especially in something like a contest dungeon where it's probably going to be more important that you do good damage so that you can spend less time risking dying. Then lastly, I'd recommend having Leviathan's Breath with Catalyst and Whisper again with Catalyst. Both of these weapons are kind of long-range precision choices. I would use Whisper if you can because it has similar DPS, slightly lower but much more total. However, it's a lot less forgiving if you miss a shot than Leviathan's, whereas Leviathan's is very easy to use, but has much less total damage. And now let's go ahead and look at some legendary weapons. For your kinetic slot, you're going to want to have a shotgun. You're actually going to want to have shotguns in both slots just in case your loadout calls for it. If you're using a class which might have melees, then you'd probably want to use 1-2 punch if you're going to need that. This is mostly just for Hunter. I also highly recommend having trench barrel shotguns for anybody not doing melee builds since it's one of the best ways to clear out majors and is even a decent DPS option for bosses. I'd also recommend having the Mountaintop in your kinetic slot. It's basically the best special ammo grenade launcher in the game. It does the best damage, it gives you the movement, it has the best velocity, it's very easy to aim, and it has some of the best perks in the game for grenade launchers. I'd also suggest having the Call ready to go as a weapon for ad clear. As always, rocket sidearms are some of the best ad clear in the game for super hard content. Another weapon I'd suggest having for the kinetic slot is going to be the Lost Signal. It's a very nice ad clearing weapon and can also be used in damage rotations as a replacement for Witherhoard. Supremacy is also a great pick for major clear and is an okay low commitment choice for raid DPS as well, although remember the ammo is still bugged and if that's not fixed it's going to have a pretty bad ammo economy. Warden's Law I would highly recommend if you're on Hunter and Lucky Pants is enabled. It's super good with Lucky Pants, pretty much the best hand cannon for that. I'd also suggest having an Eminence ready. It's one of the better kinetic legendary primaries in the game. Basically, if your exotic slot is taken elsewhere and you still want to be able to produce ammo, I'd use Eminence. It's also a nice utility choice, having a lot of really good perks for that. And lastly, I'd suggest Vulpecula / some other shoot to loot weapon in the kinetic slot. If you don't have the Vulpecula because it's heavily FOMO'd, you could also go with the Stasis auto rifle available from the current season as well. Now getting into the energy slot, I'd recommend having some kind of rapid fire sniper. There's a lot of equally good choices, but like the Ikelos sniper, the Distant Tumulus if you're an oldie like me, anything like that, just a good rapid fire sniper just in case you end up needing that. I'd also suggest having Aberrant Action / Indebted Kindness, Rocket Sidearms, same thing as the Call, very good in hard content. I'd also suggest having Forbearance or Marty's Retribution. Waveframes have fallen off a little bit in the meta, but they're still really good, and if we end up having big groups of ads all spawning together, obviously a waveframe is the fastest way to get rid of them. I'd also suggest having the No Hesitations. It's a nice support option and can definitely help out your team. Make sure you're using Physic on it so that you get restoration from it as well. And remember, it's also a stacking damage buff for your DPS as well, so it's just got a lot of nice uses there, and it's one of the better primaries at killing enemies too. And on the topic of legendary primaries, I would also bring along the Nullify. I think the Nullify is by far the most lethal legendary primary in the game right now, and so it's going to be your best bet for making ammo with the energy slot with a legendary weapon. And lastly, the Mahis for Hunter if you're running Lucky Pants. Same deal as Warden's Law, it's a double frame and it has good perks. And finally, getting to the end of this rather long video, we're going to have the legendary heavy weapons, and surprisingly there's not really that many. Firstly, bring an Eager Edge Sword. They're very helpful in roam content. They can help you dodge damage as well as just get to objectives faster. It might also help you get through jumping puzzles quicker, which is going to be helpful for getting through the day one. Next up, we've got the two staples, Apex Predator for rockets and the Edge Transit for grenade launchers. I'd also recommend having a Wendigo if you're going to be doing Cloud Strike. Then I'd also recommend having at least some kind of good machine gun. My go-to is probably going to be Commemoration. That's pretty much the best machine gun in the game. And then some good swords. Sonum Bonum is pretty much the best sword in the game in the heavy slot. However, it's important to remember that only one person on the team can run it before you start getting some weird damage fireteam scaling. And so if somebody else is going to be running it on your team, then make sure you have some other swords available to use as well. Pretty much anything with Whirlwind Relentless, and if you want a surrounded sword, make sure you're using Bequest as it has more impact than any other sword in the game, but only has access to surrounded. Of course, that all hinges on the boss being surrounded compatible at all in the first place, and if he's not, then you would just want to fall back on the Relentless swords instead. Anyway, that's going to do it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. And really quickly before you go, I want to let you know I've got a really cool Discord server I'd love to see you guys join. I'm pretty active in there, and we have a lot of helpful channels for you guys, like a loadout link archive, as well as some other resources for figuring things out yourself, and of course just a good group to talk to about anything Destiny. Let me know in the comments what you thought of my suggestions here, if you have any more you think people should be watching out for, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!